Hi, welcome back to another episode, 27 of the Carolyn Glick Middle East News Hour. And I'm overjoyed that my estimable co-host, Gadi Taub, is back with me after a long sojourn in the land of the free and the home of the brave, the United States of America. He's back safe and sound in Israel and Tel Aviv. So, hey, Gadi.
I am back and with a mug of national conservatism, where I attended the conference in Orlando, which you didn't, although you were invited, due to family concerns.
But I had two kids with COVID. You wouldn't have gone either.
Yeah, right? And you probably wouldn't have been able to get on the flight with two kids with COVID. You have to fill all these forms. You have to do all these tests right before the flight. You have to, and is the Israeli government demands that you declare that you haven't been in contact with any COVID infected people in the last, 24 hours, which of course you couldn't have.
So it's a good thing that you didn't come over and visit us right before you left.
Yeah. But we had a great time in Orlando, and it was really interesting to see people coming together. And I think it gives confidence, because part of the way the left operates on social media is by condescension and mocking and cynicism and sarcasm, and a lot of this is like acid. It fragments the conservative movement or the conservative constituency. And seeing a lot of people that are so confident talk so eloquently about some of the most pressing themes was a joy.
It was a joy, and it was empowering. You know, I for many years I was going every year to the David Horowitz Freedom Center's Restoration Weekend at the Breakers in Palm Beach, which was awesome, not only because the Breakers is one of the most beautiful hotels I've ever seen, maybe the most beautiful, but also because it's not only empowering to hear people speak wisely and well about the things that you care the most about when you're being told by the evening news and everybody, you know, who's anybody in the elite of your society that, you don't know anything, or you're a Neanderthal or whatever. It's also that it was really fun. I think it's really important not only to listen to people and to speak to people, but also to enjoy one another's company. And I have to say that conservatives are some of the, don't you agree? Like, we have a great time together, and, we don't sit around. I mean, we do sit around talking about how terrible things are now that we have this terrible government in Jerusalem, but it's also fun because it's good.
Conservatives are far more tolerant. And this fun. Is something, and this is something, and more fun, and this is something that would probably surprise people on the left. But the left is only tolerant in theory. In practice, is only tolerant to people who think exactly like them. So yes, it's really important to have these get-togethers. And I was overjoyed to see. I don't know if you see, talking about the way the left handles the media, this tweet and Substack by Andrew Sullivan, who voted for Biden, but listed all the main topics on which the mainstream media, from the New York Times down to MSNBC, were wrong. And they were wrong, he said, about everything, from Russian collusion to Kyle Rittenhouse. Everything. They were always wrong, and they're never apologizing. I just wonder how long will it take, and if it ever would come, that their readers would stop believing them.
Well, I think that they've lost a lot of readers. I remember, I don't know, one of the most notorious moments for me in watching Israeli media, which is just as bad as American media in terms of its liberal bias. It's not even bias. And just like the American media have turned into just simple pure and sweet, just propaganda organs for the left, for the progressive left in the United States. The same has happened in Israel, as you know. And I remember in 2000, when the fake peace process that was born in Oslo in 1993 just turned into a complete catastrophe. And we started having suicide bombers every day in Israel. We had one of the top journalists in Israel, this woman named Ilana Dayan, who you know well, get up on the news, on the primetime news. I think it was a weekend news report. And she was saying in the panel, nobody I knew nobody that I knew, I never heard of anybody who thought that Oslo was going to fail, that there was a problem with what we were doing with the PLO, with arming terrorists, with giving them land and legitimacy and weapons and money. Who would have thought that that might lead to a catastrophe? Nobody I knew ever said anything. And I just was sitting there like this. What did I just hear? I mean, I didn't know anybody who wasn't warning that it was going to be a catastrophe, that it was a catastrophe.
Oslo was when the Israeli media turned postmodern. And the story is familiar to, I guess, Hebrew listeners, because Hanan Amiu wrote a book about the media, told it, and I told it in my book, and I told it on the media, but maybe our American or English speakers listeners in general don't. But Nachum Barnea, who was the dean of Israeli pundits, was approached by Igal Karmon, the head of memory, and Karmon translated Arafat's speeches in 1994 when he just arrived in the territories, and he said to Nachum Barnea, look, he's calling for jihad. He's lying to you. What he says in English is just a lie. And Nachum Barnea said, I won't publish this. And he said, why? It's the truth. And Nachum Barnea said, there is no such thing as truth. There are only versions. And your versions, or choose the word narrative, and your narrative is against the peace process, is against peace. So that peace trumps truth. This is basically what happened to Israeli journalism in '94. Now in America, what happened to journalism is it went crazy with Trump. And in Trump, it just decided.
Trump was the cherry on the top.
Nothing like this. They consciously changed their vocation from telling the truth to toppling Trump, and I think they should have lost the public's trust. How much did they lose? I don't know. You can look at CNN's dropping ratings, or you can look at the New York Times subscriptions. I think they haven't lost enough yet.
I agree, but I'll just say two things on that. One is that, at least as far as Israel is concerned, and as far as American Jews are concerned, the media became a propaganda organ for the regime, for the Obama administration, well before Trump decided, or certainly before he announced that he was running for president. And we saw so many of the tactics that they used against Trump and his people in terms of using national intelligence agencies against them. They used first against American Jews, particularly from AIPAC, during the fight on Capitol Hill over the Iran nuclear deal.
There was an amazing piece in the Wall Street Journal that I don't know how it just passed under the radar, but journalists like Lee Smith and others who are conducting a brave war for truth have repeatedly referred to it, and this is how I found it, is that they started eavesdropping on Jewish organizations in order to block Israel's ability to lobby against the JCPOA, the Iran deal.
Right, but you're right. I mean, I wrote about it at the time as well, and since.
But they ensnared members of Congress.
But it wasn't just Israel. It wasn't just Israelis. They were eavesdropping exactly on members of Congress and on American citizens who were Jewish, so that they were using the intelligence apparatus. The weaponization of the intelligence agencies in the United States, the NSA, the CIA, and the Director of National Intelligence, that we saw used to such effect in the FBI against Trump and his associates and his supporters during the Trump years, was first tried out or first deployed against American Jews. And in fact, the outgoing Obama administration started its entire attack on the Trump administration by using these intercepted communications at the time that they were pushing the UN Security Council resolution condemning Israel and claiming that Israeli presence beyond the 1949 armistice lines is illegal. At the UN
pushing
Security
it and then
Council.
Abstaining at the Security Council.
Right. It's a joke that it's presented, and I saw that I think it was Obama, the Washington Post had an article out at the time. How did it happen that 2234 was passed? and sort of like a last minute kind of thing that Obama didn't really know what he was going to do. This is not true. This resolution was prepared by the Americans, was prepared by Samantha Power. They wanted this resolution. And when the Egyptians tried to bow out of sponsoring it, they forced or they compelled or they pressured the New Zealand delegation at the UN to take over the sponsorship of Resolution 2234. It was that important to them. This is what Obama wanted to do. He was waiting until his last month of office to take it to Israel at the UN Security Council. He was waiting to do this, and he finally got to do it. That was what he did on his way out. And they were intercepting the phone calls between the incoming Trump team, Jared Kushner, Mike Flynn, and others, and members of the Israeli government, and using it as a cause to attack Israel and to attack the incoming Trump administration for trying to fight this rearguard effort to screw the Jews on their way out of office. So, you're right that it all came to full flower during the Trump administration, and now under the first communist government in the U.S. history under Biden. But it began against the Jews. What happens now against Americans was tried out first against American Jews and against the Jewish state. That's one thing. And the other thing was, I don't know, I forgot. Anyway, I remember just one more thing about Nahum Barnea that you were mentioning. Nahum Barnea. I have a friend, Richard Fernandez, he's out in Sydney. He's a blogger. He writes for Pajamas Media. He's got a great blog. And so he, years ago, over 10 years ago, he wrote this post where he was quoting from the diary of or a history of the Gulag. And so you had these true believers who were in the Gulag, who were being worked and enslaved and starved to death and tortured. And so some of these true believers continued to believe in Brother Stalin until their very last breath. And they found graffiti on the walls that was etched in blood sometimes and just scratched with fingernails of these true believing communists who were praising Stalin while he was literally killing them in the Gulag. And that really very much sums up the ideological zealotry of Nahum Barnea. Nahum Barnea, his son Yoni was murdered in a suicide bombing in 1996 when he was on bus route 18 in Jerusalem on his way to the central bus station to go to his base in the army. He and a bunch of his friends, they were killed. They were soldiers. And the week after Yoni Barnea was killed, Nahum Barnea interviewed Muhammad Dahlan, who was the head of the preventive security services in Gaza that was at least partially responsible for the suicide bombing, because they were the ones who were conducting the contacts between Fatah and the Palestinian Authority and Hamas at the time. And the head of Hamas at that time, Mohammed Def, he's still the commander, was Muhammad Dahlan's best friend from Israeli prison. And he was personally conducting those meetings. And it was Mohammed Def who oversaw the slew of suicide bombings in 1996, among which was the suicide bombing that killed Barnea's son. And yet a week after his son was murdered, Barnea gets up from his shiva, gets up from his mourning period, and he interviews Muhammad Dahlan. And when I saw that, and I could barely read it.
I can't judge people in such extreme.
Here you can. No, you can judge in the sense that at this moment, he chose to propagandize for the PLO. And I think that is a testament to a state of mind. And what you say, and it goes hand in hand with what he said to Yigal Carmon, that he refused to publish the truth about the Palestinian Authority, and now, that was at the height of the Oslo process. And that ended effectively in September of 2000, when Arafat, 2 months after Arafat rejected Palestinian statehood on almost the entire west bank of the Jordan River, Judea and Samaria, all of Gaza, and large swaths of Jerusalem, including the Temple Mount. And in September 2000, he opened up a jihad against Israel, starting on the Temple Mount on September 28, 2000.
I'll tell you where I disagree, because people in extreme distress, like losing a child, you can, even if you disagree, understand that his philosophy is the way to stop the bloodshed is peace. But long before it happened, his journalistic ethics were corrupted by the idea that he is allowed as a journalist to lie in the service of his ideology. So these are two different things. One can think that the way to stop terrorism are more concessions. We now know that this is a highly unrealistic and very silly idea, but people can hold it, and they can hold it honestly. This is not the same as agreeing to give gushpanka. Do you have a good word for that in English? More than support. It's the legitimacy to the idea that you're allowed to lie in the service of the things you believe in.
You're nicer than I am, Gadi. What can I say? I'll leave it to.
I'm new on the right. I just haven't become evil enough yet.
No, I mean, I saw it. I saw it 25 years ago when it happened in 1996, and I still haven't gotten over it because, at the time I was in the army, and I knew full well just how involved Mohammed Dakhlan was in the suicide bombings that were going on at that time. And, maybe it was because I was aware of just how guilty and culpable he was for the bloodshed. 60 Israelis were murdered in 8 days, in 4 separate suicide bombings. Maybe I just never found it in my heart to understand what he was going through. I don't think that that's the case. I have more information that I'm not going to share. But you know what? Everybody gets to look at the situation from his perspective and come to his own conclusion about it. But I just wanted to say that, 4 years after that, the Oslo process came to a crashing halt, just as anybody who was not looking at it through rose-colored glasses, which was actually most Jews in Israel, were warning would happen since 1993. But now we're engaged in a completely new peace process with the Palestinians, and it's just as dangerous, or perhaps more. It's just as devastating, if not more, to Israel's position in the region and in the world. And one of the most interesting things about it is that it's being carried out behind a fig leaf of Naftali Bennett's announcement and determination since he entered office in June, that there will be no peace process, there will be no negotiations toward the establishment of a Palestinian state while I'm prime minister. And yet he makes this declaration, and behind this declaration, all of the things that he claims are not going to happen, he said it most recently at the Knesset last week, are happening. And we can talk about that. That's what I wrote my column on for Friday. So I know all about it. But
is there anything Bennett did not lie about? If you have a Hebrew-speaking social media account, then you're probably familiar with the genre of Bennett's promises. People dig up from the archives things that Bennett said passionately about, for example, how Lieberman has taken right-wing votes and transfer them to the left, and how sitting with the anti-Zionist Arab parties is incompatible with Israel's security, and all this with this passion and inner conviction, or what seemed like inner conviction. And now he's doing the complete opposite, and he has this one slogan to cover up everything, and this is unity. Where now the unity is his marriage to the left over the head of Likud, and this is not a government of unity. This is a government of exclusion, and it excludes not only the whole of the right, conservative, traditional, and religious portion of Israeli society. It is also ethnically tinged against the Mizrahim. I interviewed on my podcast Dr. Mo Altshuler, who's an amazing researcher, a very smart woman, and she said, "Look, they are recreating the old establishment alliance, which was originally in labor. It was the secular labor pioneers, that the elite of labor Zionism, with religious labor, with Hapoel HaMizrahi, with the kibbutzim created by the national religious. And now she said, we see the same ethnic groups creating the same alliance in a bourgeois level. Now it's the Tzahala, it's the bourgeois kind of Yair Lapid. I don't know how to say this. The fake, feckless, thin, hollow kind of Ramat Sharon bourgeois. I'm sorry for the deep Ramat Sharon residents. I'm sure there are a few of them, but you know what I mean. Tzahala and all these people who have been pampered with pensions from the state and their families and their kids and their restaurants, with the how do you say bourgeoification? Is that a word? Oh, I'm sure you understand what I mean. It's not gentrification, but it's bourgeoisification of the settlers movement. In the settlers, I don't want to make generalizations about the whole of the settler movements, but you know, where you live in Efrat, that there is a bourgeois portion who are just glad to recreate their...
I think that the updated term, and it's updated until the 1980s, there may be a better term now, is yuppies. You know, it's not bourgeois in the sort of Marxist lingo. They're yuppies. I mean,
no, I think but it's not just yuppies. I don't think the Mitnachalim, the settlers, are necessarily.
Oh no,
yuppies,
the settlers definitely want to be thought of as yuppies. The ones who
maybe Naftali Bennett's generation, but it started before that, because there is a middle class kind of, Israel Elofra. That kind, and that.
Well, I think you might be getting too much into the weeds for our audience.
In any case, it's the same alliance. It's no longer labor. It's a middle class alliance of people whose lives are comfortable, and what they miss is legitimacy from the wide pages of the left wing press.
Well, I think you're right, but the main point here to make, I think, is that Israel was a one party town, was a one factory town for the first 30 odd years of its existence. It was run by the Labor Party, and everybody who wasn't serving the Labor Party in one way or another was completely excluded from everything in Israel, whether it was musicians who couldn't get their songs played on the radio, to politicians who were considered completely illegitimate and were never considered as possible coalition partners in any of the labor-led governments from 1949 or 1949 with the first Knesset until 1977, when Menachem Begin led the Likud to the first victory over the Labor Party in Israeli history. So since 1977, there's been this nostalgia for that period, and they always say that Israel was simpler, Israel was better then, Israel was different, Israel has become more violent, Israel has become crass, Israel has become whatever it is since 1977. And what they're really saying is we cannot stand the fact that we have to share power with anybody, or that anybody is allowed to have power in this country except us. And so, during those years, those perfect years, those harmonious years, when only one part of Israeli society was allowed to speak, and they spoke in the name of all of Israel, you did have the National Religious Party and its various permutations over the years were kind of the little brother of Mapai, of the historic Labor Party, and they were allowed to be there too. But by the way, throughout the years until Naftali Bennett did what he did in June, from 1977 on, the national religious community was actually considered to be what a retired IDF general from the old guard named Uri Sagi told me in 1994 was a deviation from the norm. It was a mistake in the assembly line because they acted like they were part of the establishment, but they were really horrible mutations of the real Israel. And that's what they were left with all of these years when all of the people that they were trying to be best friends with, they were like the unpopular kid in class, and they're trying to be friends with the jocks and Matai. All of a sudden they turned on them and they didn't let them carry their water anymore. And they said that they were evil because they were building kibbutzim and they were building communities in Judea and Samaria and Gaza. And it wasn't the secular Mapainiks who were doing it, it was the national religious community that was doing it, and as Jews, as opposed to Israelis, and they hated it. And now, and for all of these years, one of the things that really characterized the national religious community is that they wanted to go back into the fold. They had been in the fold. And then when they joined the Likud government, they were thrown out of the fold. And it was very strange to me when, from the time that I made Aliyah in 1991 until now, why anybody would care. The left, they weren't so far to the left in 1977. They weren't really a left-wing party at all in 1977. But after that, as the Labor Party became more and more and more leftist, it was as if that was less important to the national religious leadership than the fact that they weren't being nice to them.
I'm not sure what you mean by left, because it was economically speaking, it was much further to the left until the mid-60s at least.
See, in Israel, as you know, in Israel, left used to be just like in the old left in Europe, that left
socialism. Left means socialism. Yeah, it was
socialism in the economic conceptualization, not the cultural so much. And left and right over national security didn't really exist until after the Likud came to power in 1977. And then over time, the distinction between left and right in Israel became one about national security and not economics. Obviously, there were disputes about free market economics. Benjamin Netanyahu was really the first leader that Israel had that understood anything about economics, and he was the one who brought the free market to Israel. But I mean, there were other smaller parties that were too, but he was the first one to actually do it in a significant way and free up the market in Israel and liberalize it. But the disparity between right and left morphed from one about economic policies or economic organization of the government to one about national security and what Israel is supposed to be. What does it mean that it's a Jewish state, that it's the Jewish state? Those things became disputed only after the Likud took over. And part of this was because the Labor Party recognized, and this goes back to what you were talking about the Sephardic Jews, about the Jews from Arab states, that they I lost my train. It was that the economic, that it became about national security, but it was all along until 1974, and then obviously in 1977 when they lost control, the Sephardic Jews were voting for the Labor Party, and starting in 1974, and then in a very dramatic way in 1977, they lost the Sephardic vote, and the Sephardic vote went to the Likud, went to the right. And later to Shas, the Sephardic ultra-Orthodox party that was formed in the 1980s, never to return. And once Shimon Peres realized that the Sephardic Jews were never going to come back, they became much more pro-Arab because they had to find a way to win a majority in the governing coalition once they no longer had the Sephardic Jews.
Which is what you meant by saying that they turned to the left. They turned from being hawkish in the Ben Gurion fashion and into doves and extreme doves in the fashion of not just Peres but Ehud Barak and Olmert, who took the Rabin peace plan and enlarged the Palestinian state and gave up the Jordan Valley. And now Ben Gurion's and Rabin's memory is being deformed in the service of this of this extreme dovishness. And Ben Gurion was a hawk. Ben Gurion was a realist and a pragmatist and understood power, and also had nothing of the aversion of the current left to power, as if powerlessness is somehow more moral. It was, in fact, the very core of Zionism that said that being powerless is immoral. If you want to be moral, you have to do things in the world, and you can't do things in the world, you can't do things for good if you don't have power. So this is not just Ben Gurion, it's the emotional core of Zionism resented the diaspora idea that powerlessness and victimhood is somehow morally superior.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Shabtai Tevet, in his biography of Ben Gurion, he quotes Ben Gurion explaining that, exactly what you're saying, that there's an inherent immorality to powerlessness, that the Jews of Europe were victims of genocide, were annihilated by the Nazis and the rest of the Europeans who worked with them, because they didn't have power, and that power was a moral imperative for the Jews. Having power was a moral imperative for the Jews, that it's immoral for Jews not to seek power and to seek national power, because that was the only way to protect Jewish lives. And of course, that was one of the bases of modern Zionism. It wasn't the only one, but it was a very significant central one. And you're absolutely right. So it was the electoral switcheroony, right, that the Sephardic Jews did when they moved from the Labor Party to the Likud Party in 1974 and then in 1977, that and the left and the Labor Party's inability to accept that they were going to have to share power with anybody else, that led them to seek out the support of the Israeli Arabs by radicalizing their own positions against Zionism, against Israel. This is a gradual process, but it's definitely reached fruition today. And the most bizarre aspect, or the most distressing aspect of it, is that indeed the religious Zionist elite that spent, the better part of 30 years yearning to be back in the fold of the labor Zionists never seemed to notice what had happened to the labor Zionists in the intervening 30 years. And now we see the likes of Naftali Bennett and Matan Kahana and Ayelet Sheked basking in the warmth and love of the left,
bestowed by a cynical press. The owner of Haaretz, the most extreme left-wing daily in Israel, said honestly about Naftali Bennett that we're just using him, and when we're done with Netanyahu, we'll turn to Naftali Bennett and get rid of him. So Kalman Lipskin wrote, from those familiar with the Hebrew symbolism, he said that Naftali Bennett thinks that the left has crowned him as a Messiah, but the left thinks of him as the Messiah's donkey, because in our tradition, there would be a donkey carrying the Messiah. So he sees himself as the Messiah, and the left sees him as a donkey, and they'll kick the donkey's ass. They'll kick the ass's ass the minute they can, because they have no love for Naftali Bennett, whom they called a fascist just 5 minutes ago, and whom they now despise for betraying his own ideology, because the left is unforgiving of these things, and these are not all stupid people. So they saw him sell everything in order to kiss up to them. That does not make the left respect anyone. So they're just using him, and when they're done chewing him, they'll spit him out.
You made this statement before about how in the Twitterverse of Israeli Hebrew speakers, there's all of the archival material that comes up with the Naftali that we like, the Naftali that I ran for Knesset with, because I agreed with him and all the things that he said in the archive. And I saw about a week ago, I retweeted.
Yeah, you remind our listeners, Carolyn, that you were on his parliamentary list.
I was on his. I ran with him for Knesset in the first round of elections, and it was actually during that ill-begotten quest for a membership in the Knesset that I discovered that I discovered he was an empty suit. I know for a fact that I did not, in a million years, I would not have believed that he would pull the kind of stunt that he has. I thought he was just a jerk and shallow nothing, but an opportunist. But it never occurred to me that his opportunism would lead him this far away from where he was. But just on that note about the archive, somebody tweeted, and I thought it was very funny that they had one of the archival things from, the day before yesterday when Naftali was condemning the very actions he's now taking in any number of areas. And the person wrote, the archive wants to commit suicide. This is like, I can't stand it anymore. Just can't stand it. Poor archive, But I wanted the process thing because we always we want to talk about something, we talk about everything. So let's just talk about one thing for a second, because I think it's very important. So Naftali Bennett says that there's no negotiations going on now towards the establishment of a terrorist state in the heart of Israel, but you can build a terrorist state in the heart of Israel through other means than having, fancy negotiations with two high-level delegations meeting across the table from each other at some fancy room in some foreign capital. And that's exactly what's happening today. And I just want to get out 2 points. So the first point is that we're taping this show on November 17th. It's a Wednesday. And today in Oslo, of course, because why not? They have the first time in-person conference called the Ad Hoc Liaison Committee, which is a donors forum that was formed in 1993 to support the Oslo process, to support the Palestinian Authority. The United States, the European Union, the UN, Japan, and a couple of other major states, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and Israel, all come together and the PLO to raise money for the PLO-controlled Palestinian Authority and for projects towards advancing building up the Palestinian economy. And the idea of the Donors Forum, the ADLC, the Ad Hoc Liaison Committee, which convenes twice a year, is to give the money that the Palestinians need to build the institutions of their state, to build the state mechanisms in the state being built for the Palestinians. And in 1993, and all of the optimism and euphoria over the peace process, Israel started running around the world raising money for the PLO. And that didn't go very well. And everybody saw, because the left at that time, they had this idea that you could be anti-terror and pro-PLO at the same time. And of course you can't. You just cannot do that, because the PLO is terror. Like it's the architect of modern terrorism. It is a terrorist organization. It can't be anything else. I mean, it really is a leopard that cannot change its spots. And Israelis discovered this on our own backs, with the thousands of Israelis who were murdered in terrorist attacks. And we had just, in the 7 years from 1993 to 2000, twice the number of Israelis were murdered in terrorist attacks and had been murdered from 1967 until 1993, when we were ostensibly at war. So we're at peace with the PLO, over 7 years, twice the number of people are killed than had been killed in the previous 16 years. So that's just a data point to get your arms around. And of course, from 2000 when Arafat started his jihad until around 2005, when Israel finally quelled the violence, more or less, over 1,000 Israelis were killed. So now
we can't rule out this returning.
So in 2009, Netanyahu comes to power for the second time, and he was in power until June. And during that time, he worked specifically to end international funding of the Palestinian Authority. And it took a long time, but funding dropped between 2011 and 2021 by 80%. The Arabs stopped their funding of the Palestinian Authority effectively in 2020. In 2019, they gave something like $262 million, if I remember the numbers correctly. And this year to date, they've given $32 million. So they renewed the funding under Biden. but they've given $32 million. And the Americans
Germany stepped in to fill a lot of the gap that
yes and no, because the Europeans actually also cut their funding significantly. The vast majority of European funding to the Palestinian Authority today is frozen.
Yeah, but Germany stepped in. Part of what Trump did is for UNRWA. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
But I'm talking about for the Palestinian Authority.
But this is not all that different because the money goes to the same place.
No, you're right and you're wrong at the same time. It is significant because it's an acknowledgement by Israel, by the Americans, by the Europeans that the Palestinian Authority is two things. It's inherently corrupt. European Union investigations of what the Palestinian Authority has been doing with the money that they've been transferring, and these were investigations that were carried out at the urging of the Israeli government, found that 40% of the total funds never reached the places that they were supposed to go because they all lined the pockets of the corrupt leadership of the PLO that the United States is now supporting and Israel is supporting. And so you're right. I'm not saying that the Europeans aren't funding the Palestinians or doing terrible things with their funding of the Palestinians. I'm saying that specifically they're not giving money to the Palestinian Authority. They're not giving money to the Palestinian Authority, A, because they're corrupt, and B, because they finance terrorism. And so, in 2018, and again, after years of Israeli lobbying, Congress passed the Taylor Force Act, in memory of Taylor Force, the U.S. Veteran from Iraq who was murdered on a university trip to Israel in 2015 on the beach in Tel Aviv by a Palestinian terrorist. So they named this act after him in his memory. And what it says is that all American support, all American financing of the Palestinian Authority must end. So long as the Palestinian Authority is paying money to terrorists who are sitting in Israeli prisons and to the families of terrorists who were killed conducting terrorist attacks against Israel or conducting terrorist attacks against more generally. So the United States under Trump ended its financing of the Palestinian Authority. They supported the Taylor Force Act, which Trump signed into law. And now this government that is not carrying out any negotiations towards the establishment of a terror state is lobbying the Biden administration, the Arab countries, and the EU to massively expand their contributions to the same terror-sponsoring Palestinian Authority that Israel worked for 10 years to end. So now Benny Gantz, the defense minister, and Isawi Frej from Meretz, who's the Arab Minister of Regional Cooperation, have been lobbying actively the United States and the United States government, the Bush administration, to breach its own law, to breach federal law, to breach the Trump-Taylor Force Act, and to renew U.S. funding to the Palestinian Authority. And they're also going to the Europeans and saying, we want you to renew funding to the corrupt, thieving, terror financing Palestinian Authority. So aside from everything else, Israel has just wrecked any opportunity or will have in the foreseeable future to end funding, Western funding of Palestinian terrorists, because we're telling them to fund Palestinian terrorists. So this is, the amount of damage that this government is doing to Israel's position in the world and our ability to advance our national interests is obscene. And in fact, what they're doing is they're calling for the funding of a terrorist state in the heart of Israel. And the second thing that they're doing, again, in the absence of, the negotiations of the type that I was involved in when I was in the army and I was a member of Israel's negotiating team. So there's none of that going on right now. But on the other hand, what is Israel doing? We've just given permits for the Palestinians to build an Area C of Judea and Samaria. Area C of Judea and Samaria includes the Jordan Valley. It includes all the areas with the Israeli military installations in them. And of course, all of the areas that 500,000 Israeli Jews live in, like me and my family, right? And so the implication of these building permits and the fact that the government is now doing nothing to take down illegal Palestinian buildings all over Area C is that this government, the Bennett government, that's supposedly not going to allow the establishment of a terror state in the land of Israel, in the heart of Israel, is now transforming all of these thriving communities in Judea and Samaria into little enclaves, isolated enclaves that have to, go through hostile territory to get onto highways to take them to Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and Netanya.
And they're creating. It's odd that we never discussed what your vision is for a one-state solution, which I see behind your right shoulder as the title of your book. And we never discussed it here, but the more mixing of population in Area C, the worse things are going to become. And that's clear to everybody. And I think that there is, if historians would look at the large contours of how Israelis attempted to deal with the problem of a Palestinian national movement in the same part of Western Eretz Israel, land of Israel, between the Jordan and the sea, then we will see greater continuity between the so-called right and the so-called left than we now tend to acknowledge. Because as I said before, Rabin never meant there to be a complete partition of the land. And Rabin's plan is not that different than Begin's plan for Camp David, which was self-rule for the Palestinians in their own towns and areas, then called autonomy by Begin, then later by Rabin, a state minus, and then Netanyahu is heading the same thing. The aberration was Ehud Olmert and Livni, but if we count only prime ministers, then Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert. And all these plans depend on a measure of separation and a measure of the ability of the Palestinians to run their own lives in some limited territory. Now, if we're just going to mix, we are promoting more friction, and the question of whether it would turn into a civil war is, in my mind, not a yes or no question, because there'll be gradations. There'll be more and more frictions, and you live in Efrat. You know this better than I do, but we already have it seeping back into Israel with Arab citizens of Israel. And I'm sorry to bring this harsh pessimism into our generally optimistic and lively and upbeat program, but the way I see it, Israel itself is heading into something like a civil war between Arabs and Jews inside Israel. Because
but I don't think that at this point, because of what this government is doing, you can make a distinction between Judea and Samaria and the rest of Israel. Because I think that you are seeing repeated in Area C what you're seeing happening in the mixed Muslim Jewish cities throughout the country, and in the Galilee and in the Negev. And here I'll just explain. You asked me about my book. Tomorrow I'm actually speaking at a conference, which I think it's off record, but whatever, that this organization is doing with ambassadors, foreign ambassadors in Israel, about alternatives to the failed two-state solution. And so I'll be talking about it there, but I'll just say here, I wrote my book I think it was in 2012 and 2013. And that was at a time when we were seeing a very dramatic shift among Israeli Arabs towards Israel and towards Zionism. For the first time in Israeli history, it was a result of the failed Arab Spring. It was a result of the civil war in Syria and the bloodbath and the genocide that began there to unfold a decade ago. And we saw for the first time pronounced interest among Israeli Arabs to integrate into Jewish Israeli society as patriotic Israeli citizens. You saw a very large increase that continued throughout the years of Christian Arabs who were volunteering for service in the IDF. And you even saw a significant increase or beginning incipient trend among Israeli Muslims to volunteer for service in the IDF. And now what we're seeing is a complete reversal of this situation. And I wrote about it in my column last week about the implications of RAM and why I had to rethink my initial support for RAM,
the United Arab List, yeah.
Right, which is an Islamist party that was presented to Israel to Israelis as a moderate force in Arab Israeli society, as opposed to another branch of the Islamic movement. There are two branches, another northern and a southern. The northern one has been declared a terrorist organization, and the southern one is RAM, is the United Arab List that's now a coalition member. And so I had thought that Mansour Abbas's willingness or desire to join a coalition in Israel was an expression of this integrationist impulse or trend among Israeli Arabs that we had been seeing for a decade since the Arab Spring. I also thought that it was a domestic translation of the Abraham Accords, where you saw the Sunni Arabs who had previously been supporting the Muslim Brotherhood and had been previously supporting Al-Qaeda, the Saudis, the U.A.E., and others, suddenly also, like Israeli Arabs, doing a 180-degree turn away from the Muslim Brotherhood, away from the Sunni jihadist groups that the Muslim Brotherhood spawned, including Hamas, and making peace with Israel and wanting to normalize their ties with Israel. So I had been under the impression that RAM was a domestic translation of that, a domestic iteration of that. And what we found since, and it might have been, perhaps, there might have been an argument for that if it had joined a right-wing coalition that was led by Netanyahu. But what we're seeing now in this overwhelmingly...
We disagreed on that.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that I was right in retrospect, but I think that there is a distinction between RAM in a homogenous right-wing government and RAM in a heterogeneous but radical left-wing dominated government that we now have in Israel. Whatever the case may be, since it's a theoretical question that we won't know the answer to, we see that RAM's inclusion in the government has taken the trend that began with the failed Arab Spring among Israeli Arabs and turned it on its head, because RAM is actually the Muslim Brotherhood. And so what we've done is we've taken the actor that the Israeli Arab moderates, that the UAE, that the Egyptians, that the Saudis, that the Bahrainis once supported and now recoil against and view as their greatest enemy, and we brought them into the fold. We brought them into the government. We gave them control over the government because their 4 votes from RAM control whether this government survives or collapses. So they have veto power over every government decision. They have the ability to get whatever they want from this government because the government is their hostage. It doesn't exist without them. They are the power brokers in Israeli society. And what we've seen as a result is that the Arabs who want to integrate into Israel, the Arabs who are integrated into Israel, the Arabic-speaking minorities, the Druze, the Cherkesim, who have been going and serving in the IDF since the 1950s, they're being harmed. The Israeli Christians and the Israeli Muslims who over the past 10 years have been serving in national service or even in the army are being screwed. They instead of being advanced by this government and rewarded for their determination to lead the Arab community of Israel into Israeli society as full members and as patriotic citizens, they are now being pushed aside in favor of the Muslim Brotherhood that makes no attempt to hide the fact that they want to replace Israel with a caliphate, just like Hamas. Mansour Abbas, the head of RAM, said that he is carrying out a civil jihad against Israel. And this is very similar to the civilizational jihad that the Muslim Brotherhood in America declared against the United States in the early 1990s. And it's a subject of my friend Andy McCarthy's book, Willful Blindness. Or no, I'm sorry, The Grand Jihad. And it's an important book.
McCarthy served as an anti-terrorist FBI agent, was it, or persecutor?
No, he was a New York State prosecutor, and he discovered all of this.
But he was doing counterterrorism.
He wasn't doing counterterrorism. He was assigned the prosecution of the 1993 World Trade Center bombers. And it was during the course of that prosecution, of that case, that he discovered all of the documents of the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States and the conspiracy that they were waging against the United States as a form of their grand civilizational jihad against the United States and the Western world.
So I can contribute just a quote from Andrew McCarthy that I really liked, and I quoted in my book, where he said, "Islamophobia is not a phobia at all. It's a term coined by the Muslim Brotherhood in order to discourage any inquiry into Sharia supremacist ideology." And I think that's an encapsulated antidote against the scare tactics in which force us not to say the truth about Muslim terrorism.
I think you're absolutely right. And now, again, our government in Israel is at the beck and call of these jihadists in Ram, in Israel's Muslim Brotherhood. And so, Muhammad Ashtaya, who's now running around hand in hand at Oslo with Isawi Frej for Meretz, he said in September, he gave an interview to Israeli Arab reporters that was supposed to be off record, but El Quds published it and Memory translated it. And he said that if Israel doesn't agree to our terms, which is, commit suicide, then we're going to abandon our two-state support, which they don't have, but whatever. We're gonna abandon our purported support for a two-state solution. That is, that Israel can continue to exist to the side of a Palestinian state, and we're going to join forces under a unified leadership with Israeli Arabs. So he said this after the government was formed, and my argument is that what we're seeing now in Area C is really just a continuation of what we're seeing in the Negev and in the Galilee, where the government is allowing unconstrained, unlawful land seizures by the Israeli Arab community, and this is devastating for Israel's very existence. And I don't think that you can argue credibly at this point that it's possible to view Judea and Samaria in isolation from the rest of Israel, because the Arabs know, and I don't know if they ever did, but certainly now, and we saw this in May as well, with the complete integration of Israeli Arab terrorists into the Hamas's terror war against Israel. And it's very clear. A member of Akko's city council said, I think today, perhaps yesterday, that they were going to be full participants in the next Palestinian terror campaign against Israel. And by the way, he's not under police investigation, because how can he be? Since if anybody dares to lift a finger against this irredentist, terror-supporting, terror-engaging enemy who is a member of the city council of a city in Israel, then the government will fall, because Ram won't stand for it, and Ram controls the government.
Just two quick comments about the differences that I think still exist between Judea and Samaria and what you described in the Negev and the Galilee. In Judea and Samaria, we still have areas A and B, which are Palestinian enclaves, which Israelis just avoid, and it's illegal to even get there. And we would like to keep them separate. And the other is that there is a different legal status. And I think that this doesn't undermine your general argument, which is still, I think, that now this government is investing money in the Arab sector. Israel has been investing a lot of money in a kind of grand affirmative action plan in the Arab sector, but now they've handed that money to what is the de facto local branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. So we're going to see this money put into culture. Now, the left thinks that putting into culture means that they will learn about LGBTQ, but no, this money is going to go into mosques where the Muslim Brotherhood preaches its own culture. And this means that the population inside Israel will be radicalized like their brethren under Palestinian Authority. So the Hamas is controlling Palestinian Authority. We have now another branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. And as Israeli journalist Ayala Hassan has disclosed, Hamas has advisors inside this party who is now inside the Israeli government. So Hamas which is a murderous anti-Semitic ideology, has got its fingers inside Israel's coalition. And the Muslim Brotherhood is actually a prominent member on which, as you said, the coalition depends. So here we have them as the keystone of the coalition, while in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood is illegal because they understood how dangerous that could be. So the situation is completely absurd.
So just to go back to my book, I think, the trend that has just been overturned of Arab-Israeli integration into Israeli society is a key to integrating Palestinian Arabs into Israeli society, because I don't think that there's a cultural distinction between the two groups. There's a legal distinction between the two groups. There's not a cultural distinction. They don't view there to be a cultural distinction between
but Caroline, there's been no integration of Palestinian citizens of the Palestinian Authority into Israel's society. There's no
That's
trend
not
there
true.
to reverse.
No, you're completely wrong. You're ignoring
How?
over 100,000 Palestinian Arabs who are now Israeli citizens because they married Israeli Arabs. I mean, I'm talking about.
That's not proving your point.
It is. I'm saying that there's no cultural distinction between Israeli Arabs and Arab Palestinians, and it's not true that there's been no integration between Palestinians and Israelis.
So we deeply disagree, because I think that basically the Arabs in under the Palestinian Authority are much more like Arab culture in Arab majority countries, while the Israeli Arab citizens have been much more deeply influenced by Western society.
Well, I think you're wrong. Obviously, I mean, I think you're completely wrong, and I think
that's an oxymoron. You can't say that. That never happened.
I think
I once thought I was wrong, but I was wrong.
No, I think that facts, of where the Palestinians are culturally and where the Israeli Arabs are culturally are facts, and Palestinian culture, such as it is divided between, the PLO sort of quasi-secular Arab nationalism, or what was once a secular Arab nationalism, and Islamic political theory of the Muslim Brotherhood type, and the same can be said of Israeli Arabs. So. And not only that, Palestinians have been integrated into Israeli economy, both in Israel until the Oslo process, where it was stopped because of all of the suicide bombings, but certainly into the communal structure of Judea and Samaria. At any rate, obviously we have a disparity of views here, and we should talk about it more. But I think that so long as there's not any sort of significant integration on the basis of an acceptance of Israel's identity as a Jewish state, something that was happening over the past decade, it's very difficult as a practical matter to talk about incorporating the Palestinians of Judea and Samaria into Israel. And so I think, that what has happened to us over the past 4 months since this government was formed is that we're taking away options. We're making it much, much more difficult to either separate, as you would want to, and have autonomy of the Palestinians in one form or another in areas A and B, and Israel being able to secure its national and security interests in Judea and Samaria in perpetuity. But I think that a parallel and in fact, identical trend is happening in Israel. I think that Ram's inclusion in the government, what we're seeing today and what I wrote about last week in my column and what Ad Hoc group exposed and Ayala Hassan first reported 3 weeks ago, is that the exact same trend is now being carried out among Israeli Arabs by the massive empowerment of the Muslim Brotherhood by the current government. So I think that we're taking away a lot of options that Israel painstakingly developed over a decade, and we were doing it at light speed under this government, and it's very dangerous and it's very terrible. And I'm really glad that you're back arguing with me about this and talking to me about all this. We missed you. I know a lot of the viewers on our program missed you and said, when is Gadi coming back? I want to see you fighting with him. Where is he? You know, where did he go? Where did he go? So anyway, we're glad to see you again, Gadi. And we being the royal we, me, myself, and I. And look forward to seeing
we'll continue this argument.
And to develop our ideas. I think it's very important, not only for us to develop them for ourselves, but I hope that our audience, that you guys find it interesting to see that even people who agree about most things aren't quite sure about some things, and that's okay. And look, we don't hate each other. We actually kind of like each other sometimes, right?
Rumors have it that we do.
Rumors have it that we're friends. And we didn't even manage to talk about the two conferences that we spoke at. You spoke at one
today,
and I spoke
today, just today in the Knesset. Check it out on my Hebrew Twitter, because I put my short speech there.
I'm trying to figure out how to put my speech up on my Twitter account. By the way, all of you, if you were wondering why I'm not on Facebook, I can't get into my account. Facebook figured out a way to not have me on Facebook. So you'll have to go to carolynglick.com, to our YouTube channels, to our Twitter accounts, and maybe one day I'll be able to get back into Facebook, but who knows? At any rate, and Rumble. So watch us, subscribe to us, subscribe your friends and nodding acquaintances to our show, and have a great day. Take care, everybody. Thanks so much.
Bye, Carolyn. Bye.